Legalized Fiction, Exposé on Government Legalized Weaponization of Language, Fraud of Legalization, Absolute Nullification of Tyranny, How Legal Definitions Replace Truth with Control, a revolutionary dissection of juridical deceit in the age of regulatory empire, written by Professor Isaiah Alleman, Department of Cannabis Legal History, independent constitutional scholar and jurisprudential analyst, prepared for those who still believe and behave in the supremacy of natural law, primacy of conscience, the restoration of the Republic, anticipate, academic, historical, legally revolutionary discussions and distribution, exposing government's legalized weaponization of language, c. 2025, Isaiah Delmar Alleman, all rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means electronic, mechanical, photocopy, recording, scanning, or any other digital or analog types or forms of duplication, in full or fragment, or used in any manner without the purchase proof from the author of prior written descriptive permission, that shall be signed with one true physical biometric doublet self-authenticating, plastic aka molded print, or similar readily visible signature by the true copyright owner, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review, article, and interviews. Additionally, any unauthorized distribution, sharing, or sale of this book, whether in physical or digital form, is strictly prohibited and may result in legal action. The author reserves all rights to this book, including but not limited to the right to revise, edit, and adapt the content in any way deemed necessary. Any infringement on these rights will be pursued to the fullest extent of the law. If you have any questions or concerns regarding the use of this book, please contact the author directly. Thank you for respecting the author's intellectual property. Book design by Isaiah Delmar Alleman, ISBN, physical copy, ISBN, digital copy, table of contents, preface, deceit of legalization cannabis, commerce and counterfeit freedom, words as weapons, the silent war against meaning, the linguistic coup of the modern state, jurisdiction by semantics, consent through deception, Part 1, A War on Meaning, How the State Redefines Reality, 1. Legal lawful and inversion of authority, 2. Fiction as fact, corporate personhood and symbolic consent, 3. The erosion of sovereignty through legalese, 4. Judicial sleight of hand, how courts uphold the lie, 5. The Constitution misread, a treatise on enumerated power, 6. Cannabis versus marijuana, a linguistic weapon, 7. Controlled substances, controlled minds, 8. Legalization, the plantation model repackaged, 9. Regulation as revenue extraction, 10. Nullification, the forgotten remedy, 11. State sovereignty and cannabis resistance, 12. Case law and precedent in the fight for the plant, Part 3. Lexicon of subversion, a legal dictionary of deception, 30 terms that don't legally mean what you think. Each entry, common definition, legal definition, Black's Law Dictionary, historical usage or case precedent, shocking real-world implication, key terms included, person, citizen, individual, resident, license, consent, legal, lawful, marijuana, substance, property, income, employment, register, trust, corporation, and 15 more. Part 4, Manifesto of Nullification, 10 Declarations to Restore Lawful Sovereignty. 1. Declaration 1, Legality is not law. 2. Declaration 2, Words have been weaponized. 3. Declaration 3, Rights are inalienable. 4. Declaration 4, the CSA is void. 5. Declaration 5, Licensing is servitude. 6. Declaration 6, Nullification is a duty. 7. Declaration 7, Jurisdiction must be rebutted. 8. Declaration 8, Silence is not consent. 9. Declaration 9, Sovereignty is not subject to statute. 10. Declaration 10, Educated defiance is the path forward. The final unmasking, when meaning is murdered, so is liberty. Appendices, A. Full legal definitions with Black's Law Dictionary citations, B. Key U.S. Supreme Court rulings and interpretive case law, C. Suggested affidavits and templates for lawful notice, D. State nullification precedents and constitutional models, E. Annotated bibliography and foundational writings. Title, The Language of Control, Exposé on Legal Definitions, Cannabis Deception, and the Nullification of Tyranny. Introduction, War on Words and the Struggle for Freedom. The power to define is the power to control. In the modern age, the weaponization of language is not merely a tactic of persuasion, it is the foundation of societal control. Words, once pure in their meaning, have been redefined through legal doctrine, rendering them unrecognizable, and distorting the very essence of truth, justice, and liberty. The greatest deceit within the cannabis debate is the term legalization. The term, as wielded by those in power, has done little to free the plant or its users. In fact, it has done the opposite. By permitting cannabis use only under highly regulated, commercialized frameworks, the government has not liberated the plant, it has recolonized it, transforming an ancient medicine and spiritual ally into a commercialized product controlled by state and corporate interests. What has been called legalization is, in reality, a system of conditional liberty, where permission must be granted, licenses must be obtained, and compliance with state-imposed regulations is mandatory. The true freedom of cannabis can only be restored through nullification, not through regulatory frameworks that uphold the very mechanisms of oppression. Legal war on cannabis and the illusion of legalization. Our exposé is not just a critique of cannabis prohibition, it is an urgent call for the nullification of unjust laws that have been warped by the state and legal system to control the natural world and its inhabitants. The common understanding of cannabis as a plant of freedom, healing, and liberation is in direct conflict with its legal status as a controlled substance, subject to harsh regulation, criminalization, and commercial monopoly. This disconnect between the common and legal definitions is no accident. It is a calculated strategy by which the language of law has been manipulated to perpetuate power and deny citizens their fundamental rights. This manifesto shall explore the misleading redefinitions of key terms like legalization, marijuana, drug, medicine, and commerce. These words, when reinterpreted within the legal framework, are stripped of their natural meaning and imbued with corporate and governmental control. Through detailed analysis, we will expose how the legal system creates an illusion of freedom while preserving a system of state-sanctioned subjugation. By understanding the profound impact of legal definitions on cannabis and its users, we can begin to unravel the deception and demand nullification, the restoration of true liberty for all who seek to grow, share, and use cannabis in its most natural forms. The fight is not merely against prohibition, it is a fight to reclaim language and restore sovereignty. Next steps: expand on key terms within the cannabis section, such as marijuana, controlled substance, property, medical use, and regulation. Incorporate historical legal usage and court cases to underscore the legal manipulation of language. Highlight the difference between legalization and nullification, showing how legalization still maintains control, while nullification truly restores freedom. This will be followed by a detailed analysis of misleading terms in the legal lexicon. Critically examine the misleading legal definitions and expose the stark contrast between common understanding and legal manipulation. Each term will be thoroughly deconstructed, with historical examples, case law, and the deeply revealing implications of their redefinitions. Part 2. Illusion of cannabis legalization. 1. Marijuana. Common definition. The term marijuana is widely understood as a drug derived from the cannabis plant, often smoked or ingested for recreational or medicinal purposes. It is seen by most people as a harmless plant, an alternative to alcohol or tobacco, with healing properties that promote well-being. Legal definition. In contrast, the legal definition of marijuana is a manipulated term under U.S. federal law. According to Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed., marijuana is defined as all parts of the plant cannabis sativa L, whether growing or not, and the seeds of such plant, the resin extracted from any part of such plant, and every compound, manufacture, salt, derivative mixture, or preparation of such plant or its seeds or resin. Court cases and historical usage. Use of the term marijuana was specifically designed to evoke negative connotations and racial prejudice. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was the first federal law to criminalize the plant, using the term marijuana to elicit fear. The law's architects, including Harry Anslinger, demonized the plant by linking it to immigrant communities, particularly Mexican Americans, and claiming that it incited violence, insanity, and criminal behavior. This racially charged propaganda was pivotal in the criminalization of cannabis. United States v. Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative, 532, U.S. 483, 2001. The court reaffirmed that despite the commonly accepted medicinal use of cannabis, the legal system viewed the plant through a lens of illegality and regulation, thus continuing the misleading portrayal of cannabis as inherently dangerous. Implication: the term marijuana has been weaponized to obscure the plant's true nature as a natural, medicinal herb, rebranded as something alien and dangerous. The legal use of the term effectively erases the legitimacy of cannabis as a plant of the earth, and relegates it to a criminalized substance under the law. 2. Controlled substance. Common definition. A controlled substance in common parlance is often understood as any substance that is illegal or regulated due to its potential for abuse or harm. People typically associate it with dangerous drugs, such as cocaine or heroin. Legal definition. According to Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed., a controlled substance is defined as a drug or chemical whose manufacture, possession, or use is regulated by the government, particularly those that are illegal or restricted. Under the Controlled Substances Act, CSA, cannabis is classified as a Schedule I drug, meaning it is considered to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, despite evidence to the contrary. Court cases and historical usage. The classification of cannabis as a controlled substance was cemented with the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which placed cannabis alongside heroin and LSD, based on the political and social climate of the time, rather than scientific evidence. This decision ignored mounting evidence of the plant's medicinal properties, and instead reinforced public fears perpetuated by decades of misinformation. Gonzalez v. Reich, 545 U.S. 1, 2005. In this case, the Supreme Court upheld the federal government's ability to regulate even intrastate use of cannabis, effectively sidelining states' rights and medical marijuana programs, and reaffirming the criminalized status of the plant under federal law. Implication: the designation of cannabis as a controlled substance serves to perpetuate its illegality under federal law, despite the growing body of research supporting its medical benefits. Legal classification as a controlled substance effectively creates a legal fiction, where cannabis is placed on par with the most dangerous narcotics, irrespective of its historical and medicinal significance. 3. Property. Common definition. In everyday language, property refers to something that is owned, something that can be used, sold, or transferred. People generally think of property as a tangible object like land, a house, or personal belongings. Legal definition. Under Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed., property is defined as anything that is subject to ownership, a right or interest in something that can be possessed, used, or transferred. The concept of property extends far beyond mere physical objects to include intangible assets, intellectual property, and even rights granted by the state, which could include the right to grow, sell, or use cannabis, but only under strict regulation. Court cases and historical usage. The legal system's manipulation of property rights has profound implications in the cannabis debate. For example, in the case of Kaiser Aetna v. United States, 444 U.S. 164, 1979, the court ruled that the government could not easily seize or control property without due process. However, in the case of cannabis, the government claims authority over private property when cannabis is involved, often violating property rights under the guise of regulation. Implication: by redefining cannabis as a controlled substance, the state has essentially claimed ownership over the plant itself. This is a subversion of property rights, where individuals who may legally own land are still denied the right to cultivate what naturally grows there, due to governmental control over the substance. 4. Medical use. Common definition. In common parlance, medical use refers to the therapeutic application of a substance to treat or alleviate symptoms of a disease or condition. When people speak of cannabis use for medicinal purposes, they imagine it as a natural remedy, often a non-toxic alternative to pharmaceutical drugs. Legal definition. The legal definition of medical use is often restricted and highly regulated. According to Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed., medical use is defined as the use of a drug or substance under the supervision of a licensed healthcare provider for the treatment of a medical condition, in accordance with medical standards and governmental regulations. In many states, even where medical marijuana is legal, the regulations governing its use are highly restrictive. Patients often need to obtain a state-issued medical card, purchase only from licensed dispensaries, and comply with strict dosage guidelines. Court cases and historical usage. The legalization of medical cannabis, as seen in the case of Conant v. Walters, 309 F. 3D 629, 9th Ser. 2002, demonstrated that federal law still holds precedence, despite state-level protections. This case upheld the federal government's control over the medical use of cannabis, highlighting that medical marijuana users are still treated as criminals under federal law, even with doctors' prescriptions. Implication: the term medical use in the context of cannabis is reduced to state-sanctioned commercial exchanges, where access is permitted only through licensed establishments. True medical autonomy, the right to self-medicate or cultivate one's own remedies, is denied, reinforcing the commercialization and monetization of natural healing practices. 5. Regulation. Common definition. Regulation in common language typically refers to the process of establishing rules or guidelines to ensure that things are done fairly and safely. People generally see regulation as a necessary oversight to protect public safety, whether it's food, drugs, or even financial transactions. Legal definition. According to Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed., Regulation is defined as the act of controlling or directing according to rule, principle, or law, often exercised by government agencies. In the case of cannabis, regulation often means compliance with state or federal laws that restrict not only the production and sale, but also the personal cultivation of cannabis, even for medical or recreational purposes. Court cases and historical usage. The regulatory approach to cannabis is typified by the state-by-state legal framework, as seen in Gonzalez v. Reich, 2005, where the federal government's power to regulate cannabis even in states where it is legal is affirmed. This is a key example of regulation becoming a tool of subjugation, where the state grants or revokes access to the plant based on compliance with government-sanctioned terms. Implication: regulation in the legal system is not designed to liberate or protect individuals. It is a system of control, restriction, and commercialization, creating a framework where freedom is not inherent, but granted through compliance. Next steps: continue developing additional terms in this vein, exploring the deep impact of legal language manipulation on cannabis users, cultivators, and advocates. Integrate historical legal precedents, case law, and calls for nullification in each term's analysis. Will expand further into the lexicon of subversion, stark contrasts between common and legal definitions, and the revolutionary implications of these discrepancies. Focus on the manipulation of language to maintain control and hinder true freedom. 6. Prescription. Common definition. A prescription in everyday usage refers to a doctor's order for a patient to receive a particular medication, usually because the drug is necessary to treat a condition. The common understanding of prescription implies a legitimate and accessible route to obtain needed medications. Legal definition. Under Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed., prescription is defined as a written order from a physician or other qualified practitioner for the preparation and administration of a drug or device to a patient. However, in the case of cannabis, the legal framework often limits prescriptions to very specific circumstances and requires state authorization. Even where medical use is legalized in certain jurisdictions, cannabis remains restricted by a complex web of regulations that prevent its free accessibility. Court cases and historical usage. Ruan v. United States, 142 S. Court, 2370, 2022, the court clarified that doctors must adhere to federal guidelines when prescribing controlled substances, even if a state has legalized cannabis for medical use. Despite the prescriptive power of physicians, this decision underscored the federal government's overriding authority, demonstrating the legal limits on medical freedom and autonomy in the cannabis realm. Implication: while prescription is typically seen as a standard part of healthcare for treatment, in the context of cannabis, it becomes a bureaucratic barrier, a means of regulating and controlling access rather than facilitating legitimate medical care. This regulation reduces cannabis to a commercialized product only available through licensed dispensaries, thus undermining the true medical autonomy that should come with prescribing. 7. Drug. Common definition. A drug in common usage refers to any substance that has an effect on the body, often associated with medicinal use or recreational use, such as caffeine, alcohol, or prescription medications. The common understanding generally recognizes that some drugs are beneficial, while others are harmful. Legal definition. According to Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed., drug is defined as any substance recognized as a drug in the official United States Pharmacopoeia, National Formulary, or Homeopathic Pharmacopoeia, and any substance intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. Cannabis is legally classified as a drug under federal law, but the classification has significant implications for its legality. Despite overwhelming evidence of its therapeutic potential, cannabis is placed in the same category as harmful narcotics like heroin, under Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. Court cases and historical usage. In United States v. Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative, 532 U.S. 483, 2001, the Supreme Court held that despite cannabis-recognized medicinal uses in certain states, it was still considered a controlled drug under federal law, reinforcing the demonization of cannabis as a dangerous substance. Implication: the use of the term drug here distorts the reality of cannabis as a naturally occurring plant with significant healing properties. The legal framework surrounding cannabis maintains its status as a dangerous drug, despite its non-addictive nature and proven medicinal value, leading to public misunderstanding and unwarranted fear. 8. Medicine. Common definition. Medicine in everyday usage refers to substances or practices that are used to treat or cure diseases, alleviate pain, or promote health. People generally understand medicine as something that is prescribed by a doctor and is used to improve health. Legal definition. Under Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed., medicine is defined as a substance or preparation used in treating disease, a drug or remedy. Despite its therapeutic potential, cannabis is denied the status of medicine in many jurisdictions, even in cases where it has been recognized as such under state law. The federal government has gone so far as to restrict access to cannabis-based treatments, despite the increasing body of evidence that supports its use in treating conditions, such as epilepsy, chronic pain, and cancer symptoms. Court cases and historical usage. In United States v. Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative, 532 U.S. 483, 2001, the court found that medical necessity was not a valid defense to federal prosecution under the Controlled Substances Act. This ruling demonstrated that the legal system does not recognize cannabis as medicine, even if it is prescribed by licensed physicians. Implication: the denial of cannabis as medicine by the legal system perpetuates the myth of illegality and undermines the valid therapeutic use of the plant. Cannabis as medicine is systematically controlled and withheld from the public, despite its proven efficacy in treating a range of conditions. 9. License. Common definition. A license in common usage is typically seen as permission granted by an authority to do something, such as driving, operating a business, or hunting. People generally think of a license as a validating document that allows individuals to freely engage in certain activities. Legal definition. In the legal context, a license is defined by Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed. as a permission or authorization to do something, typically granted by a government or authority. For cannabis users, a license often refers to state-issued medical marijuana cards or business licenses for dispensaries. These licenses are tightly controlled by the state, effectively making access to cannabis dependent on compliance with restrictive regulations. Court cases and historical usage. In Kirk v. State, 827 NE, 2D 1037 Ind. 2005, the Indiana Supreme Court held that even with a medical marijuana license issued by a state, the federal government could still prosecute individuals for possession of cannabis. This ruling highlighted the dual systems of regulation and the legal supremacy of federal law, demonstrating how licenses can be used to restrict, rather than expand freedom. Implication: licenses are often used not to empower individuals but to restrict and control access. The licensing system for cannabis usage and sales creates a barrier between the public and the plant, transforming what should be a natural right into a privilege granted by the state. 10. Regulation. Common definition. Regulation in everyday usage is understood as the setting of rules to ensure fairness or safety. People generally see regulation as something that ensures order and compliance, but it is often thought of as a necessary and benevolent system. Legal definition. Under Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed., regulation is defined as a rule or directive made and maintained by an authority to manage conduct or operations within a particular scope or area. Cannabis regulation often involves a system of taxation, licensing, and law enforcement designed to control the cultivation, sale, and use of the plant. Court cases and historical usage. Gonzalez v. Reich, 545 U.S. 1, 2005. In this case, the court ruled that even if states have legalized cannabis, federal law still holds regulatory power over the use, distribution, and production of cannabis. This decision expands the regulatory reach of the government, cementing state dependency on federal policies. Implication: the legal system of regulation does not liberate cannabis users. Instead, it imposes controls and restrictions on a plant that has been used for centuries for healing and spiritual purposes. The system's primary goal is to manage and profit from cannabis, rather than promote true freedom. Next steps. Continue exploring additional terms and their impact on the cannabis narrative, including terms like commercialization, medical marijuana, treatment, decriminalization, and more. Integrate deeper legal analyses to show the complete redefinition of the plant and its users under legal frameworks. Understand legal hypocrisy embedded in marijuana prohibition and legalization of cannabis, its nefariously misleading legalization narrative. You will expose discrepancies between common misunderstandings, legal reality, point out how prohibitive structures and law continue to work against the public good, even when laws appear to be moving toward liberation when the opposite is in fact true. 11. Decriminalization. Common definition. In popular discourse, decriminalization is often understood as the process of removing criminal penalties for certain activities, often with the expectation that the behavior in question is still regulated but no longer subject to arrest, prosecution, or harsh penalties. For cannabis, the common understanding is that decriminalization means accessing cannabis without legal threat or criminal consequence. Legal definition. Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed. defines decriminalization as the reduction or removal of criminal penalties for certain acts, often changing them from criminal offenses to civil infractions or regulatory violations. However, decriminalization in the context of cannabis typically only reduces criminal penalties, but does not remove the prohibition. Even in decriminalized states, cannabis possession can still result in fines, confiscation, or other penalties, and distribution remains heavily regulated, with ongoing criminalization for non-compliant parties. Court cases and historical usage. In Ridgway v. State, 869 SE, 2D 346, 2016, the Georgia Supreme Court ruled that despite the decriminalization of possession of small amounts of cannabis in certain areas, federal prohibition still applied, and individuals could be subject to federal penalties for possession. This revealed how state decriminalization is often a symbolic gesture, not an actual path to freedom for cannabis users. Implication: the common understanding of decriminalization would lead people to believe that cannabis use is largely unpunishable under the law. However, the legal reality is that decriminalization merely softens penalties, while still leaving in place the fundamental prohibition against the plant. This hypocrisy allows for state-level changes in policy, while maintaining the federal war on drugs, creating confusion and false hope about the true legal status of cannabis. 12. Legalization. Common definition. In everyday terms, legalization refers to the full removal of restrictions and criminal penalties for an activity, allowing it to be conducted freely within legal bounds. Most people understand legalization of cannabis as a move to allow anyone to grow, possess, and use cannabis in the same way as they would other legally sold and consumed products. Legal definition. Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed. defines legalization as the act of making an illegal act lawful by changing the laws that prohibit it, particularly concerning the possession or use of a substance or activity. However, legalization of cannabis has often been implemented with stringent regulatory measures and limitations that preserve the legal control over the substance, meaning that cannabis remains tightly regulated and often only available through licensed dispensaries. It is still highly controlled in many states, subject to taxation, and restricted in ways that do not match the common understanding of freedom associated with the term. Court cases and historical usage. In Gonzalez v. Reich, 545 U.S. 1, 2005, the Supreme Court reinforced the federal prohibition of cannabis despite California's legalization for medical use. The ruling showed that even when states pass laws legalizing cannabis use, federal law supersedes state decisions, meaning that legalization remains superficial in the face of federal constraints. Implication: the legalization of cannabis, as widely understood, implies complete freedom and access. However, under the legal framework, legalization often entrenches government control over the substance, creating more avenues for taxation, surveillance, and law enforcement involvement than existed under prohibition. Instead of freedom, it manufactures a regulated market that disproportionately benefits corporate interests and leaves many individuals and businesses with limited access and opportunity. 13. Public health. Common definition. Public health is generally understood in society as the well-being of the community, focusing on disease prevention, health promotion, and ensuring access to necessary healthcare services for the general population. It is associated with welfare and public safety. Legal definition. In Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed., public health is defined as the health of the population as a whole, often considered in terms of preventing and controlling disease and injury through public policy and regulations. In the legal context, public health regulations around cannabis are designed more around control and regulation than ensuring actual well-being. The focus on health is often skewed by the government's financial interests, such as the taxation of cannabis, rather than true public health considerations for the entire population, which includes unrestricted access to beneficial remedies. Court cases and historical usage. In United States v. Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative, 532 U.S. 483, 2001, the Supreme Court ruled that despite medical necessity, the federal government could still prosecute individuals using cannabis, thus showing that public health policies often reflect regulatory goals rather than actual concern for the well-being of individuals. Implication: the public health narrative, when applied to cannabis, often focuses on controlling access to the plant rather than promoting its full therapeutic potential. Cannabis's medicinal use is obstructed by laws that limit its availability, and health outcomes are restricted by bureaucratic red tape that prioritizes control over public health. 14. Prohibition. Common definition. Prohibition is understood as a total ban on a substance or activity, with penalties for violations. People associate prohibition with the outright criminalization of behaviors or products considered morally wrong or dangerous to society. Legal definition. In Black's Law Dictionary, 6th ed., prohibition is defined as the act of forbidding or preventing something by law, often with criminal penalties for violations. The prohibition of cannabis is rooted in the criminalization of the plant, which is still maintained by federal law despite state-level changes in policy. Even in states where cannabis is legalized for medical or recreational use, federal law maintains its status as a controlled substance, continuing the prohibition of cannabis use in a de facto manner. Court cases and historical usage. In Gonzalez v. Reich, 545 U.S. 1, 2005, the Supreme Court ruled that even with state-level medical marijuana legalization, federal prohibition could still be enforced, demonstrating the continuing hypocrisy in the legal system, where decriminalization or legalization at the state level does not fully negate the federal prohibition. Implication: the hypocrisy of prohibition is staggering. On the surface, some states may claim legalization, but the federal government still enforces prohibition through a variety of means, including taxation, regulation, and criminalization of non-compliant actions. True legalization in the sense of complete freedom is not achieved. Instead, a form of legalized subjugation persists under the guise of regulation, with corporate interests benefiting from the continued restriction of cannabis access. Exposing on legal hypocrisy. The language of legalization and decriminalization is manipulative and hypocritical. On the surface, it appears that progress has been made toward cannabis freedom. In reality, what has occurred is a shift in regulatory control, enabling the government to maintain oversight, profit from taxation, and hinder true access to the plant for millions of people. By redefining key terms such as legalization, decriminalization, and medicine, the law creates an illusion of freedom while continuing the systemic control of cannabis use and cultivation. Preface: words as weapons. Throughout history, empires have been built and destroyed by armies of men, but maintained by armies of words. Governments do not merely control behavior, they control language, and through language, they seize the mind. Words, once the property of the people, have been hijacked by legal systems, bureaucrats, and technocrats to construct a false reality, one in which the governed are not only confused, but complicit in their own subjugation. This manifesto is not a critique, it is a legal autopsy. The corpse on the table is the complete truth, cold, mutilated, renamed, and served to a generationally starved population. We have the exposé of systematic linguistic betrayal before us, and in front of us, wherein the common language of the people has been subverted by the legal class to create two parallel realities, one of common understanding, and one of tyrannical manipulation. In the latter, cannabis does not mean cannabis, legal does not mean lawful, and freedom is granted only by license. Citizen is redefined as a person, the natural is reclassified as the criminal, and our sacred plant is wrongfully relegated and forcefully relegated to controlled substance, a term more dystopic Orwellian than scientific. This is not an academic exercise in etymology, it is a call to defend against war, violently imposed silent subjugation from tyranny of tyrants, the redefinition of illegitimately legalized real falsification through law. Language is the first battlefield. When the state gains control of a people's vocabulary, it no longer needs to conquer their land, it has already conquered their minds. In the courtroom, a man who believes he is free uses words that betray him the moment they leave his mouth. He appeals to rights defined by those who deny them. He speaks of legalization while still living under prohibition. He begs for permission when he should be declaring sovereignty. What follows is a systematic dissection of the legal lexicon. Each word is a weapon disguised as neutral, deployed as deceptive, and designed to uphold systems of control while convincing the public they are free. We begin with the word cannabis because the war against it has become the longest ongoing, most visible, and pervasive example of linguistic tyranny. The legalization of cannabis is not liberation, it is a corporate coup, cowardly, unlawful, malevolence cloaked in benevolence, smiling at upholding injustices of every form and fashion, enforced by unrealistic regulation, and designed to exclude the very people who needlessly suffer under willfully ignorant prohibition. Where nullification would restore sovereignty, legalization preserves subordination and thereby legalize slavery. We do not seek reform, we seek clarity. We do not ask for rights, we reclaim language for our historically evident already reserved rights. This manifesto is the indictment. Its purpose is not merely to expose, but to shrewdly awaken. To the judge, the lawyer, the professor, the police, congressmen, governors, everyone in the supposed public offices and the citizen alike, know this: you do not speak the same language as the law, but after this you shall uphold the will and the rights of all the people, without exception. Part 1. A war on meaning. Legal versus lawful. A constructed divide. In ordinary discourse, the words legal and lawful are often used interchangeably. To the untrained mind, they are synonymous. But in legal reality, a realm of deliberate obfuscation, they diverge with surgical precision. That divergence is not accidental, it is a deliberate artifact of statecraft, wherein law ceases to reflect natural justice and begins to serve institutional control. A thing may be legal without being lawful, and lawful without being legal. The former refers to conformity with statutes, codes, and regulations issued by corporate government bodies. The latter refers to conformity with higher, natural, or constitutional law. This distinction is not semantic, it is the fault line on which entire civilizations pivot between liberty and totalitarianism. Black's Law Dictionary, 6th edition, defines legal, conforming to the law, permitted by law. Legal is used as an antonym of illegal, but it is also used to mean related to law. Lawful, in accordance with law, permitted, sanctioned, or justified by law. Lawful more clearly implies an ethical content than does legal. The latter goes no further than to denote compliance with positive, technical, or formal rules. The very publication that claims authority over legal language admits legal does not mean right, it means permitted. Lawful implies legitimacy, legal implies subordination. The consequence? A system in which slavery can be legal, genocide can be legal, the theft of property, the suppression of speech, the imprisonment of the innocent, all can be technically legal, so long as they are written into statutes and enforced by courts. Meanwhile, acts consistent with higher moral law may be criminalized. Thus, the state becomes the arbiter not of justice but of obedience. The codification of confusion. Law does not exist to clarify, it exists to codify. But codification, by design, creates a professional class of linguistic gatekeepers, lawyers, judges, and legislators who selflessly reserve for themselves the exclusive right to interpret language at the direct expense of but not to benefit or inform the governed. In doing so, they establish a sovereign monopoly on meaning. The average person believes that a person is a human being. In law, it may be a corporation, a trust, a ship, or a legal fiction created on paper. The average person believes consent means voluntary agreement. In law, silence can be construed as consent. The average person believes that legalization means liberation. In law, it means regulated permission granted by the same entity that previously prohibited. This is not ignorant incompetence. This is criminal coercion to completely control. Ignorance is no excuse to begin with. Prohibitive ignorance was no excuse, and legalized ignorance is no excuse. It is the slow re-engineering of human consciousness,